Thank you so much. Yes, the new department is very exciting. So I'm going to jump right in with a question that many of us have thought about before. How can we protect the environment? What can we do? If you're like most people, you would think of something like protecting stronger punishments for companies that break the law or legal action. You might think of a collection of civic actions, so voting, conservation activities, company boycotts, or protests, or a smaller group of people, say something like developing new technologies, maybe more in this room. But no one says education. And I'm going to tell you today of why we should. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to talk you through a collection of projects I'm working on with a collaborator at UC Irvine, Evan Schofer, and a postdoc here at Stanford, Jared Ferruta. So I'll give you a little bit of background about higher education, and then I'm going to talk you through 3 sets of findings. One about the association between higher education and a set of environmental outcomes. Another about different paths through which higher education can shape environmental outcomes. And then a third about the conditions under which this association between higher education and environmental outcomes exists. So before I jump in, I just want to tell you why I'm passionate about this research and how I got into it. I grew up in Vancouver, in British Columbia, and I grew up hearing stories about my grandmother getting arrested at protests to protect BC's old-growth forests. It was very shocking to me as a child that my grandmother got arrested. And also about my uncle going on the first protest mission for the group that later became Greenpeace. So I was very inspired by their activities, sort of towards social change and the impact their activities had. And this led me in my professional life and later in my research to focus on civil society, NGOs, nonprofit organizations. That's where a lot of my work sort of lands. As I learned more about this through my research and my professional experiences, I also came to see the fundamental role that education plays in this kind of action. So universities are sort of organizing hubs for a lot of social activism that happens around the world. They also are the centerpieces of knowledge around which a lot of social action takes place, both the scientific knowledge and the knowledge about human rights and social justice. So universities sort of create and disseminate this kind of knowledge that generates social change. I'll tell you a little more about universities in a moment. But an important thing to know is about the expansion of higher education in our lifetimes. So around the world, since 1970, there's been an enormous expansion in higher education enrollments in every world region. In 1970, around 10% of the relevant age cohort was enrolled in higher education. By today, it's over 40%. So there's been this enormous expansion in recent decades, and we want to look at how this expansion is linked to different kinds of environmental outcomes. So there are 3 ways that universities and enrollment expansion might be linked. One is developing new technologies. Another is universities shape individuals. They change attitudes and opinions. And a third is influencing social structures. So they create a society of people who accept university knowledge as legitimate and authoritative, both schooled and unschooled persons, when the social structure is changed. This means that experts, people who hold university degrees, are the key builders of modern social structures. These are professions or occupations, laws and policies, formal organizations, and bodies of knowledge. So an interesting thing about these paths, ways that universities change society, is they could go either direction in terms of the impact they have on the environment. New technologies could help or hurt. Same with attitudes, same with social structures. So what direction is the association going to be? There's good reason to think that university expansion will be harmful to the environment. So the key focus of higher education for many decades has been economic development. The core role of universities is seen as promoting economic growth, increasing productivity, sort of contributing to consumption and extraction, not protecting the natural world. So how can we learn what universities are doing? Our approach is global. So we take these enrollment levels in every country we can get data for around the world. This is for 2014. You can see there's wide variation across countries. The light blue, sort of 30% or less. The darker blues, some countries are 70, 80% of an age cohort of the full population enrolled. So then we look at the association between these levels of higher education and different environmental outcomes. A challenge in doing this is that countries are very different. They're not very comparable. And there are lots of things other than higher education that shape environmental outcomes. So we use regression as our tool to look within a country over time and to control for the other factors that might matter, like GDP, like percent of an economy that's related to industry. So lots of things that I'm happy to talk about, maybe in Q&A. So I want to walk you through the kind of problem with looking cross-sectionally, one point in time, a little bit. So here is just the relationship between higher education enrollments and one outcome we might be interested in, carbon emissions, in 1990. If you were going to look at this, you would reasonably think that there's a strong positive relationship between higher education, so as more of the age cohort is enrolled in higher education, emissions are much higher. At the high end, we get more developed countries. I've labeled on here the US and Canada. At the low end, we have Nigeria, El Salvador. So this is at one point in time, if you looked. But if you look over time, we start to see a different picture. So just for 8 countries, I've plotted each year from 1990 to 2014. Now the picture starts to change. India and China look pretty much like the prior slide, but Brazil, Russia looks kind of flat. And then a bunch of other countries, actually the trend looks the opposite direction when you start to look within a country over time. So we don't want me cherry picking a few cases either, though. We want to look at this for every country. So if we then plot every country over time and try to think about what's the average association, what would the average arrow look like? In addition, control for all the other factors. So once we do that, we end up with an association that looks like this. So slightly negative. Within country, the average association is as higher education increases, we have a slight decline in carbon emissions. This sort of, the shape of this association we see for several other outcomes. So if we look at nitrous oxide emissions, a similar kind of finding using the same method, also methane, and a few other emissions and pollutants that we looked at. If we move to forest area, another outcome we might be interested in, here we see as higher education increases, we have a slight increase in the expected amount of forest area in a country. And a more substantial change, renewable energy use. As higher education levels increase, predicted renewable energy use increases. So what does this tell us? Since the 1990s, that's when the study started, higher education is associated with improvements on multiple different environmental outcomes, despite its historical and ongoing role in economic growth. So I want to shift to thinking a little bit more about the paths through which this occurs. I mentioned 3 at the start of the talk. So there's a group of studies in science and technology studies that talk about the link between higher education and patenting. So that's sort of outside my area, but there's a strong link there. Social psychologists routinely show that one of the strongest predictors of pro-environment attitudes is levels of higher education. Where I'm going to focus is on social structures. So in particular, I'll talk about national climate mitigation policies, numbers of environmental, non-governmental organizations, and the stock of knowledge about the environment, so formal publications. So if we look at how higher education shapes some of these pathways using that same process, we see that as enrollments increase, we have an expected increase in the number of national climate mitigation laws a country would have. There's a more substantial association in the expected number of environmental NGOs, so environmental organizations, that a country would have, and even more substantial link to environmental publications. This is one of my favorite of these findings. It should be very intuitive. As higher education expands, there are more publications about it. But it's not one that ever gets mentioned in terms of links to environmental outcomes, that as the stock of knowledge about it expands, we can do more to protect the environment. So the main takeaway from thinking about these paths is that higher education creates the social structures that constitute the human-environment relationship. The university graduates generate knowledge that's seen as authoritative and legitimate, and they build the government and non-governmental institutions that define and regulate how we relate to the environment. So this is sort of describing a process for you, but it doesn't tell us why this happens. A kind of obvious answer would be something like, well, there's a big problem. We all know there's a big problem, so of course universities are doing this, working towards sustainability. It's a little more complicated than that. So to help think about it, I want to take you for a minute to think about a totally different higher education system than the one we're used to here. In the Soviet Union, there was greatly expanded higher education. In the USSR in 1980, the age group cohort enrolled was about 50% versus about 25% in the US at the same time. So a big higher education system, but it was tightly linked to the state. The state controlled what majors there were, what classes constituted a major, what faculty taught, what research got done, what jobs were linked to what majors. It was a tightly controlled system built around the state's economic goals, industrial development, and goals of political control. That kind of system we would not expect to generate a lot of sustainability activities. So with that in mind, we want to turn to look at the relationship between higher education and environmental outcomes across different levels of democracy. So returning to the first outcome I showed you, carbon emissions, just as an example, if we look at the within-country association, just in highly democratic countries, we see pretty much the same trend that I showed you across all. It's actually a little bit bigger of an association, but pretty similar. If we look at just the low democracy countries, there's a much different situation. So the expansion of higher education in countries that are not democratic is not linked to environmental outcomes the way it is in high democracies. So what does this tell us? Higher education protects the environment in liberal democratic contexts. So it's not just our knowledge about the severity of the problem that matters. It's also about the freedom and choice to act. So this includes the decision about what knowledge to create, what to study, and how to apply what gets learned. So overall, my work shows a lot about the interconnection across different kinds of fields and trends in society. So yes, technology matters, but also education and even the state of democracy globally for environmental outcomes. So part of what drew me to the school and why I'm so excited to be here with you was to be in a place that centers this interconnectedness across different fields and issues as part of its core mission. And I think what I presented today about higher education and sustainability, it's what we're all doing here. So I hope you saw pieces that connect to your work and your experiences, and I'm eager to talk more with you about it. Thank you.